Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and what a pleasure to be here and to meet so many people I worked with in the 90s and indeed over the past 4 decades. It is such fun to be back in Canterbury. Thank you for this invitation, and now let's get down to business, because I know you've had some speakers on agriculture. I know this because they're my friends. Some of them are my students. Some, in fact, all of them I published with. John McCaw, he was here last week. Very good student. A plus. Same as his cousin, or second cousin once, or whatever that relationship is. I taught Richie McCaw as well. I like to think when he's doing the, do you remember that? Hey! I taught him about soil science. He was checking the field. I suspect that it made more of an impression on me than it did on him, but you know, dreams are free. And what I'm talking about today is not a dream, it is the reality. I'm a scientist. Facts, evidence, data. Love it. And my students know this. I know that having taught at various institutions around New Zealand and across at the University of Melbourne, that when my students start saying in their reports, the facts, evidence, and data are, I've done it. I came from Britain. Don't you love the fact that it's off the edge? I came to New Zealand, jewel of the Southern Hemisphere. I came to learn about agriculture. And that was 1976, the 4th of January. New Zealand was closed for 6 weeks, but I found a job in our Kino sheep and beef station. So yes, I can shear a sheep, but it's very slow. Much better at milking cows, which I still have to do periodically when, you know, I'm the relief milker's assistant. Usually at duck shooting weekend or something. So it is still possible. But the global leadership role in agriculture has not got less. It has not diminished. And New Zealand is a fabulous place in which to be teaching agriculture, to be discussing it, because after all, you need a farmer 3 times a day. In fact, these days it appears to be about 6. Or is it just constant? You need a farmer for the food we eat, and New Zealand produces superb food. Now, contrary to what you might believe, New Zealand is a beautiful environment. Look at that second line and know that this comes from Treasury, not social media. And I accessed it, 23rd, 2 days ago before leaving Waikato, just to check that it was still there. Treasury understands, because the facts are with us, we have plentiful clean water, clean air, productive soil. Our soils are fabulous. Why did I stay in soil science? Because the answer lies in the soil. Those of you who come from the UK. The answer lies in the soil, and from the soil, well, I've published in plants, soils, atmosphere, and environment in general. So I was the director for the Office for Environmental Programs at University of Melbourne, because they understood that the soil is the start of everything. So I've concentrated looking there. Clean air, productive soil, climate, long coastlines, all of these extraordinary biodiversity. The Treasury says this. So believe the facts as opposed to some of the other things that we see, and know that beautiful New Zealand has been, well, when you look at this map, what do you see apart from the several islands? You might see it was done by AgResearch. AgResearch has been around since 1992. It was formed from the DSIR and what was at that stage Ministry for Agriculture and Forestry, I think at that stage. But the Department for Agriculture was formed back in the 1890s. In the 1890s, we've been doing this work with farmers for so many years. 1926, the DSIR was formed, looking at a bit more of the scientific stuff, so it wasn't so much on farm and in research farms, it became in the laboratory and glasshouse as well. But a lot of it focused on how we use our land use best. Now, Stephen Goldson, and you might like to have him to talk at some point, was looking at this map and said, suddenly, I was chairing the meeting, Jack, what's all the yellow? Well, you can tell me what the yellow is. It's beef and lamb, beef and sheep, beef and sheep. Red is dairying, and the lavender colour is sort of cropping. So we get a bit of cropping around here, well, horticulture around there, a bit of cropping around there. Dairy, pine trees, dark green, black is conurbation. Urban, sprawl, taking out our best soils. But looking at that map and noting that there's a lot of area that is actually Department of Conservation Estate. You know, we have over 30% of New Zealand in the Department of Conservation Estate. That takes your taxes over the past however many years you were working to support it. And in fact, the DOC reckons they have only enough money from the government and from donations and walkways and those things to look after about 10% of the land in the way they'd want. And you probably know that with an export economy that is dominated by the primary sector, there would be very few taxes if we didn't have something that is exported, and it's mostly called food and fibre. 50 billion is the estimate from dairy and meat and a certain amount of wood this year. 50 billion. A bigger proportion of a bigger pie every year due to the work that has been hugely science and extension people and farmers working together to work out what the best use of that land is. And it changes. One of the fabulous things about the expansion of horticulture and indeed of dairy is the fact that our income stream has been going on. And with our ever-increasing science, the impact of everything that we're doing has got less and less. John McCall will have talked about his fabulous machines and what they enable in terms of productivity. So, back to the history, New Zealand Grassland Association, and I was president of that last decade as well. I've been so privileged. But as president, was very hot on, fueled by science, tempered by experience, and the experience comes from the farmers, working with the scientists, and frequently, as Tony will remember, I did some work on the Canterbury Plains when I was with AgResearch Grasslands down here, and then Lincoln University. And it was the farmers ringing me up about all of that nitrogen work. What are the results? I haven't harvested the crops yet. It's only December. You know, they'll be coming in at the end of, well, in January generally. But it's agribusiness as well. Most of my students have gone into agribusiness now, and it's helping the farmers, particularly out of the University of Waikato, this was the case. And some of them are consultants. My classmates are still in this area, as well as being scientists and indeed farmers. And the thing that I just gave you the clue about was when I first started and saying, I've been working with some of you for 40 years. There have been gaps. There have been gaps. But we know each other in New Zealand, and this whole community is what has brought New Zealand to its leadership position. And other countries look at us and say, you know, when you took those subsidies off in 1985, was that a good idea? Well, we are the most innovative group that exists in terms of agriculture. And here are the productivity data produced this year, looking at the labour productivity and multi-factor productivity. I didn't put the arts and leisure industry up here. That was what Helen Clark thought would be really good. Do you remember in the knowledge wave, all that work at the turn of the century? Well, that's negative, so it was too depressing, because I quite like the arts. But no, it's not where you will actually get any productivity gains. You don't get them much in accommodation and food either, because how many beds can you make in an hour? It doesn't change much, does it? And after COVID, the food thing, well, how many tables can you wait an hour? It depends if they're 2 meters away or 1 meter away, or, you know, it's all of those sorts of things. IT and communications is a very small component. Therefore, it's 6%, which has been since the global downturn. It really boosted during COVID because everybody was working at home. Retail, where do they get the money to spend? Every dollar that comes into the country from the dairy sector, and you've seen it's going up. Fonterra reckons about 13, maybe 14 billion this year, goes round about 8 times. It's not a multiplication, because actually, if we saved anything, it would be about 5 times, because you're supposed to save about 20%, so it keeps getting smaller. And of course, you do pay the tax man. But nevertheless, it circulates that many times. Sheep and beef, the banks reckon about 7 or 8 times, 6 or 7 times. Dairy's 8. They buy more stuff to keep themselves going. So the money that comes in from agriculture keeps the lifestyles of the Aucklanders in the way they want them. And they're taking our soils as they expand inexorably through Pukekohe and those beautiful soils. But they sometimes forget that, and I try and remind them. Don't read Google about me. We have fabulous soils upon which to make this productive base. Oh, I forgot to tell you, UK, in terms of its productivity gains, 0. Why? They farm subsidies. Same with EU. I had a message from my schoolmates only 2 days ago saying they don't know that they can stay in agriculture because the costs, we think fuel and food are bad here, try there. And the subsidies, because of the whole Brexit thing, are being redirected. And just like in New Zealand, if you have been a very good farmer and doing the right thing in terms of planting, as the science develops, how do you get better? How do you get better? New Zealand has fabulous soils. There's been a lot of talk about how we can build up our soil carbon as a mitigation against climate change. I would hesitate to use the words regenerative agriculture because they really imply that we have degraded our soils. Have a look at them. 90, maybe even 100 tonnes to 30 centimetres in comparison with the USA and Australia. And you will notice that all the proponents of regenerative agriculture are either not in agricultural science or they're in agriculture but from other countries. And they are not telling, in my view, this is going only to members, isn't it? They are not telling the truth. They don't understand the context of what we're dealing with. And our farmers have maintained or built this up over the years, mostly because it's pastoral agriculture. There are animals involved. So they are actually helping with the soil quality. Note, I don't use the term soil health because seriously, you can't feel the pulse or whatever, but you can talk about soil quality, and it's usually to do with the organic matter. Organic matter is 58% carbon. I wonder if Ants covered that last week. Great mate, we were at varsity together. I've worn so much better. Because I'm slightly younger, but not much. So we have fabulous soils, and our goal is to maintain them. And one of the things that people forget is if they suddenly change a system, we'll actually lose that carbon. And that's not what we want to do. John McCaw is probably in the area where there is some very good increases across the Canterbury Plains. But if we suddenly stop using the techniques that we're using at the moment, did he mention glyphosate? Shock horror? Right. So if we stop using that, we'd be more into carbon dioxide from fossil fuel and we'd lose more carbon from the soil. Because of our beautiful soils and our superb farmers, we are very good nitrogen managers. Shock horror. We are. We lose far less, use and lose less nitrogen in terms of our production than other countries can manage. And I remind you that Treasury says we've got plentiful supplies of high quality water. We can come back to what's happening on the Canterbury Plains and all the alarmist stuff. But here are the data. That's beef in comparison with America per kilogram of edible meat. And that's when we use New Zealand dairy beef. Fantastic. And the dairy beef thing, probably only in the last 10 years, but farmers thinking, actually, I've got several members of the family. Maybe if the dairy farm produces crosses that will be okay on that nice country that the beef people have got, then I can have a family business with their different interests. And so that is what's been happening. And the environmental benefits and the greenhouse gas benefits are clear. When we look at the cradle to grave work, this is AgriSearch, beef greenhouse gases, this is the dairy beef, and that's harder hill country. Look at that, the top is better than the European average. And look at Italy. They should just stick to Ferraris, really. Oh no, they use fossil fuel as well. We like Italy because they take our good merino and our good leather. The rest of it, they are totally disorganized. They're also the highest users of antibiotics in terms of active ingredients per kilo of live weight, something like 343. We use 9. That's in animals. It's no comment about humans. Human use is right up there with any other developed country. It's particularly high in Auckland, particularly the southern area. And this, if we want to know where antibiotic resistance is coming from, we need look no further than ourselves. Misuse. So, hope you're all feeling really positive about what New Zealand manages in terms of greenhouse gases for beef. Hold that thought. Here's milk. New Zealand's right at the top when you start scanning. Right at the top. Fewest greenhouse gases per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk. Fantastic. Don't buy Australian stuff, just buy New Zealand stuff. And of course we are selling that story to the world. So if you're going to be using animal products, pick New Zealand. And of course you might say, well, why do we use animal products? Well, because you're healthier for it. But just touching on the antibiotic thing, this is animal welfare, and some people will say we shouldn't be using animals at all. I was a bit distressed when New Zealand lost its A grading, which it held until a couple of years ago with Austria, UK and Switzerland, but they've changed the whole system. And I draw your attention to animal welfare gradings in New Zealand in comparison with the UK and the USA. And these are the ones I'm concerned about. Sentience, right up there. Laws, not quite so good, but you know, Wellington could fix that. Protecting animals in captivity, well, we have very few zoos, and so the database is quite small. Used for draft and how many Clydesdales do we actually have in New Zealand? For goodness sakes. Recreation, sports racing, rodeos, we still have those, and greyhounds. So maybe we need to sort that out, but that's not farming. So protecting animals used in farming, we actually have a better grade than other countries can achieve. And the problem is what you actually think you mean by protection of animals in farming. Because I remind you that the big great world, and anybody who's watched an Attenborough program will know this, is pretty brutal. Actually, it's pretty brutal. And I was in a torture chamber called The Dentist on Monday and was watching a film. There were lovely little deer running around. And then suddenly there was a lightning storm and they all got burnt up. And he said, "Are you in pain?" I said, "Turn the video off." It's horrible. So we are as good as any other country. We protect the science. Look at this for protecting companion animals. Bet you the Aucklanders wouldn't like that, would they? And lifestyle blockers, I'm afraid. So, wild animals, yeah. So, support for, because we have the International Animal Welfare Standards, absolutely. So we need to sort out government accountability and laws against it, and then we'll be up higher again. Isn't that odd? But when you hear PETA, People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, making statements about we're only a C grade, you need to look in and see where the problems are. And actually, I'm staggered by the companion one. We've managed sustainable food production. We manage our environment. Remember what Treasury said. The economy, remember it's 50 billion this year, and efficiency. We are more efficient. Productivity, the amount of product we produce per hour or kilo of fertilizer, whatever else, and we produce food sustainably. Might not be what you've heard, except from your previous speakers. I've shown you the least greenhouse gases, and New Zealand's right up there. It's sustainability, it's a soils-orientated definition, And you know that since the Brundtberg discussions that the whole what does sustainability really mean has been going on. But look, pretty clear really, we've got to feed people and we want to do it ever more efficiently. We've got to increase food security, and that's why we use irrigation. You know that only 10% of New Zealand is irrigated, don't you? It just happens to be mostly down here. And even it's, when you look at Canterbury, it's less than 10% because Canterbury is really much bigger than just the crop circles. We must protect, and this is why I'm in agriculture, by the way. When I was 16, now some years ago, and at school in the UK, a country of slightly smaller than New Zealand and had 58 million people in at that stage, I was thinking, well, how are we going to feed people in the future? There were 3 billion people in the world, and we now have 8 billion, and we're doing it on very little less land because of our productivity gains. I decided that the best thing I could do in order to feed people sustainably was learn how to produce food sustainably, and that's to save the environment. Haven't managed it yet. Brazil's a worry to me. A lot of Asia is a worry to me. Africa's a cock case. It's got to be economically viable. If you don't have a viable business, I mean, you talk to John McCaw, that's a family farm. I worked with Erina and John, and I've probably forgotten his name, Peter, earlier, and then taught John. Same with the Mars. So there's another guy to talk with. He did his Nuffield on glyphosate, so he'd be a good speaker for you in the future. Otherwise, you don't get to pass it on. Pass it on in the way that isn't called child abuse anyway. And social acceptability. And this has become the biggest issue in the last couple of decades with increasing awareness and the whole business about social media being able to spread information. The comment about regenerative agriculture is that it's pretty much like the organics. It's very similar to organics. Movement was in the 40s, but it's got much greater traction because of social media. So moving on. Peter picked it up. People for the ethical treatment of animals. We've got to become vegan. Certainly Greta Thunberg is. So it's 20th of February 2020, and she says you've got to stop eating animals. You mustn't travel anywhere, except she appears to. And then we'll save the world. And the Vegan Society here picked it up, not just Peter, and they put out this statement: you wouldn't if we gave up meat and dairy, you wouldn't have to give up flying or petrol cars. It's a sort of statement that makes me think, really? And I spend an awful lot of my time chasing up these really type moments, or hearing something and then trying to see, did I miss here? Should I be getting AIDS or something? How could that be true? And chasing it up and thinking, well, no, it's not true. So if we ate a plant-based diet, we would save 0.82 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year per person. Good-o. If we lived car-free, remember, we don't have to give up eating meat or dairy or if we gave up meat and dairy, we wouldn't have to give up cars, 2.4 tonnes if we gave up cars, or one return flight to the islands for us, and they're desperate to have us go there and spend money so that their economies can recover, and apparently we're desperate to have all the doors open so that they can come back, and all I can think is, don't they know you have to fly to get there? How could you swim? No. So it's all a bit odd and people get in a muddle, but eating a plant-based diet will save you less than 1 tonne of carbon dioxide. Estimates are it would only be about 2% of your lifetime's equivalent if you gave that up, and that's without the implications which are actually worse for the environment, but that's the problem. Have one fewer child. That's the problem. It's people, it is people, it is people. And we all know that. And we can see that there has been quite a change. It's taking its time to get through Africa, Asia, South America, but that is the problem. and people considering whether they really need to go a big car or to go to the islands for their holidays. But everything else they can do will be of assistance, but that's how much upgrading light bulbs will save. Not really very much, is it? And then, by the way, on country districts, green light bulbs don't last very long at all because they can't cope with the power fluctuation. Boom. So I think they're actually worse. But they said New Zealand emissions are among the highest per capita in the world. This is true. We do have a lot of ruminant animals. There's a bit of a debate going on about the difference in the weight of the greenhouse gases versus the warming potential. And some of you will be aware that the warming potential of methane is being recalculated because when it's done on the same basis as carbon dioxide, it overestimates its effect. And so what the world is trying to do, except for Brazil, is stabilise the methanes. And the really appalling thing for me, it's the sort of thing that drives me dilly, is that the whole of livestock agriculture and manure management is 5.8% of the global emissions. That's the same as fugitive methane. That if the oil and petrol, the coal industry, the fossil fuel industry would capture, and the technologies are available, and if they captured them, they'd have more to sell, which might not be in itself a good thing, but it's cost neutral or cost small, then we would have solved 5.8% of the methane problem. I mean, we'd have removed that much, and that's the same as animal agriculture. They could fix it. Infuriating. So should we give up animal agriculture? Well, it's because of things like this. Livestock taking up 80% of agricultural land with less than 20% of the world's supply of calories. I remind you, it's only 5.8% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but it's still statements like that. Calories? Is that why we eat animals? So when we see this, which is poor and Nemechek's data as well, beef has the biggest carbon footprint, but the same food can have a range. So New Zealand's right down here with the low impact stuff. Note that a chocolate bar from deforested rainforest is actually almost as bad as average beef. And I just remind you that what they term high impact, the beef animals in feedlots in America, what everyone thinks about feedlots in America, are actually eating mostly waste, dried distillers' grains from either biofuel or distillery for alcohol, not stuff that we could eat. People forget that. Over 90% of what they eat is not human edible. Interesting. It's actually been used first for biofuel or alcohol, both of which I approve of, so it's great that somebody then makes more use of them by eating the waste product. So the real thing here is biggest carbon footprint. This is a greenhouse gas emissions per serving. So a serving of beef and a serving of chocolate. Well, one is protein and the other one is delicious. So I get in a bit of a muddle when they start doing comparisons like this, because you're not going to have a serving of chocolate with your greens and potatoes, are you? I mean, what would your child eat? The chocolate. So I think these sorts of things are completely useless in terms of comparisons because they are not like with like. How can you eat a balanced diet? I will come back to that. These are the questions I ask. These are the questions that I ask my students to ask when they're analysing any sort of problem. What is our starting point? How can we build up? Don't you look at your watch like that, Michael. What is the starting point? That's only 25 minutes. What are you trying to compare? Are you trying to get your protein? Well, it doesn't matter how much chocolate you eat. There isn't going to be any. So are you cutting your greenhouse gas footprint by substituting beef for chocolate? Well, possibly not, but it's just a stupid comparison. And the comparison for New Zealand in terms of carbon, when most of the work was done in the Dust Bowl of America, where there's 10 tons of carbon and you can build it up, you need a lot of nitrogen and water. But you can do it. 850 kgs of nitrogen a year. It's good, isn't it? On the Canterbury Plains, you're just under 190 at the moment, and most of that goes off in milk. What comparisons are being made? You can't compare chocolate and beef with any sort of brain involved. What are the concerns? And I need to know the facts, evidence, and data supporting those concerns, and to think about what the alternatives might be, because some of the alternatives are worse. And if we get rid of animal agriculture in New Zealand, which is what Greenpeace and Peter would quite like to do, how are we going to afford to be able to look after the land? Because cropping can't take over much more, and it uses much more nitrogen, and it requires more cultivation. Grow more wine. But you see, Geeson's makes most of its stuff in Marlborough, doesn't it? Or down in Otago. Not the best country here for wine. Good for, we hold the wheat record, but you know that. Absolutely. 17.6 tonnes of feed wheat. Fantastic. Average for the world about 10, if you're lucky. So think about whether our alternatives, and horticulture, market gardens use far more sprays as well. Of course they do, because their stuff they grow is yummy, and that means more insects and diseases. We need to know the science. So this was yesterday's headline, oh joy. Greenpeace, cow numbers are too high for rivers, we've got fabulous water. I'm coming back to the colorectal stuff. Our climate, what? That's the 50% of greenhouse gases in New Zealand come from agriculture. We produce 0.2% of the world's greenhouse gases, and so agriculture is it's less than 0.2%, is less than 0.1%. Dairy cows are half of that, so it's whatever I've got to, 0.1, 0.05, less than 0.05. And with that, we feed over 1% of the global population their essential amino acids. That's pretty fantastic. Leslie can do the calculations. 0.051, that's a good ratio. Cow numbers are too high. Well, I look at some of the data and I just think, what are they trying to achieve here? Fewer cows, and then what? It's $13 billion. We also get headlines like this, the plant-based meat revolution, because you know the whole world's becoming vegan, and synthetic protein's going to make the answer. Yes, you've seen it. We've got Impossible Meats, Memphis Meats, the Impossible Burger, all of those sorts of things. Anybody tried it? Some of my students have the one that's synthetic, and they've said if people think this is as good as a real burger, it's an indication of what they eat normally. Because honestly, I know it's coming up to lunchtime, but does that seriously look appetizing to you? I have to declare I've been vegetarian since I left, well, before I left the UK, but that's, you know, that is not dairy or eggs or those sorts of things. It's the whole business about white veal, and I'm a bit extreme, but you might have picked that up. Honestly, I went home from the farm having fed calves and piglets and things, and Mother said it was veal and ham pie for dinner, darling. In the 1975, that's white veal. It's 3 months grass-fed in the dark. It's not nice. So that was it, really. Mind you, I was a student for a long time, so it's cheaper. But I just don't think that looks very appetizing. And I have eaten, because my little sister brought them, and I love my little sister, and I did eat the vegetarian sausages she'd bought. But it was only after I thought these are the worst things I've eaten for a very long time that we found out when they said remove wrapper, they didn't mean the outside one, they meant the ones that were holding the sausages together. So I chewed my way through. Oh, that's the truth. It's awfully good for my guts. We have articles, headlines like this as well, on all sorts. RNZ featured this, 33% of New Zealanders ditching meat. Seriously? It's the sort of thing that makes me, seriously? 33% of, I know we've got a switch in the younger generation, I know we've got a switch in some ethnic and religious type, but at 33%? No, there's real data. I love real data. Thank you to the University of Otago people who produced it. They talked to 12,500 people, and most of them were omnivores. Oh no, 13,000 people. Of the vegetarians, within the year that this study went on, between 18 and 19, vegetarians, 17 became vegan, but 20 changed to vegetarian. Of the vegetarians, 125 went back to being omnivore, and only 121 changed to being vegetarian. And some vegans became, 24 became omnivore, and only 23. You know, it's always worried me. I've been vegetarian since 1975, when 4% of the UK was vegetarian. It's 5% now. And they've got a bigger population, and with more ethnic variety. So don't believe that the whole world is going vegetarian. Seriously? Even fewer going vegan. Why? Because they understand the issues. So when you see the numbers are increasing, do they ever put forward the ones that have changed? No. And they missed this thing. Beyond Meat shares fall. Too many missed deadlines. People thinking actually the real stuff's better. And so all these, the VATs and the synthetic stuff, they're a novelty. People try them. Super. Can be quite good. Variety. All of those sorts of things. But people are not becoming vegan. And though you will see that they are eating less meat, it's probably good for them. Most people buy food because it tastes good. They look at price, they look at health, convenience. Fascinating to me that environmental sustainability is down there. It used to be just called sustainable, now it's environmental. Only 30% or so of people look at environmental sustainability. Now that might be the group we want. Fine, but we must never forget taste and price. And because of our productivity, we manage to keep things on the international market. But this is really important. Why do they look for taste? Why do they go back to the real stuff? Well, animal source foods have allowed us to be large, have complex brains, and be active social primates. You think of famous vegans, koala. I'm not commenting about the syphilis. They don't move very rapidly, though, do they? And in terms of complex brains, they haven't sorted out how to cure the syphilis. So moving on hastily, this is the most famous vegan in New Zealand. I've checked that this is staying just to neighbours, your members. Anybody with a farming background will look at Susie and think, body condition score what? 2? Did I hear 2? Some people would say 1.5. The closest thing I have to a partner is called a vet. He says you couldn't put that on a truck. It's put down in paddock or special treatment to feed it up again. And of course they have Learjet, so they don't need trucks, but seriously, that is dangerous. And the problem for me is that they've got 5 children between them, so she's not thinking about producing any more, but at 16 years old, they're not going to. And those girls that are following Greta and becoming vegan to save the world do not realise that when they're about 32, they're thinking, that's funny, why aren't I having babies? And it's because they've stuffed their reproductive system. Complications, and you know, human anatomy and physiology varies between people, but there are indications that there are problems, and that's hardly surprising when you look at them. Natural. The International Food Information Council, from which those red and green squiggly lines came from, this is the most sought after label, and it's what we do. Add kiwi fruit to that, little pots of vitamin C, avocados. And you've got a whole menu from what we produce in New Zealand, and it's wanted. Not this stuff, not that stuff, not that stuff. What we produce. This is the plant-based thing. Does this look natural? You've got to get pea isolate out of split peas, which come from Canada, by the way. We can't grow them economically here. You do a certain amount, some of the requirements involve genetic engineering. You squish them up, potato, pumpkin, rice bran oil, and then you flatten them and you say it's delicious. Okay, that's fine. But people forget, with lovely products like quinoa, that actually the usable protein is very small. If you look at the back of the packets, they're being quoted as dry ingredients. And you do have to expend greenhouse gases, making anything like chickpeas that we can't grow on the Canterbury Plains, quinoa that we can, and it's also being grown up in the North Island. But it's not very much per 100 grams usable protein. And part of the problem with protein is that it's made up of different essential amino acids, and we need 3, lysine, leucine, and cysteine, that are not found in great quantities in plants. And of course, there's all of this sort of stuff that requires greenhouse gases to go. This is the cultured meat, grow them up in vats. Vats require sugar, and sugar comes from plants. And plants require all the things like cultivation, fossil fuel, chemicals, fertilizers to get an economic yield. So we're not any further forward. And you've seen some of the statements about these synthetic foods. Wow, they are using so much less land, water, greenhouse gases. Richard Branson says so. Well, he's an entrepreneur. So moving on from there, they're doing it by looking only at the factory in which these things are made, not the plants that they needed to squish up to make the plant-based stuff, and not the energy that it requires to ferment in the vats. That's terrible. But it's the sort of thing that I'd say, well, how can it be 96% less? But then the reality for vats, calculations out of Netherlands, 10% of the world's meat, 4,000 factories, 382 million euros. Let's get real. And by the way, you can't get stainless steel for the vats anyway. And why isn't it going well? Because when you've got a fermentation vat, it's very difficult not to get the wrong bugs going. But the thing they've overlooked is the climate impacts of the fact, I mentioned the warming from cattle actually declines and stabilizes, and we've reached almost, we actually picked up again after the drought, but we're getting to a point of stabilization with animals. Whereas fossil fuel, it goes on for hundreds of years. So let's go back to natural. It's what New Zealand does best. And there have been calculations about this plant-based diet for America would produce 23% more calories, food, fewer of the requirements for essential nutrients, resulting in more nutrient deficiencies and a need to consume a greater amount of food solids, so your land base would increase. And when you're taking in more food solids just to get the essential nutrients, you excrete all the non-essential ones, so you actually excreted more nitrogen and there were greenhouse gas implications through the sewage system. More nitrous oxides. Vegans are worse for the planet, unless they lose a lot of weight. Here's your diet. Here's our diet. It actually requires, here we are, slightly more meat, and this is the CSIRO diet for least land, least water, fewest greenhouse gases, best nutrition for you. 80 grams, this is a day, of red meat, and 250 grams of dairy, 2.5, yeah, 250, but eat less fast food. It's all right, alcohol's in that one. And one serving of alcohol for the Australian female is 200 mils. That's quite a lot of wine. More red meat. As we mature, and this was anybody over 50, I think, was considered mature. I've often said that teenagers and young people shouldn't be regarded as mature. Should be eating this higher quality diet. More red meat, more dairy. If you want to be an athlete, better to put on muscle with animal-based protein than vegetable protein. There's research on it. I love research. But the really good thing, not even in a panic do we buy vegan food. This came out with the coronavirus, vegan food, bare shelves. Actually, I'm a scientist. I check things, a Texas hurricane picture. But the point is it's the same. Vegan food tends to go like, let's not panic about people not wanting New Zealand food. It's our sustainable food production that brings all of this together, plus education. And you are now going to spread the word. This is what continuing education is about. Because we're fighting this permanently. The lies go faster because the news organisations don't check anymore. And the number of times I'm told, have you seen this? Don't send it to me. If you click it, it will appear. And the statement is to think before you share. Massachusetts Institute of Technology. False news travels faster, and the bots, when they see what you like, the bots are doing it for you. And most people don't trust, the Pinks no trust, and this is New Zealand stuff, they don't trust social media, but they send it on. Most people in New Zealand do trust scientists. I'm a scientist. Trust me. That's been my work, trying to feed the population sustainably. Of course, I would like us to reduce greenhouse gases. And Greta has some points about not eating as much meat. She is wrong about giving it up entirely. She has a point about not doing as much travel, but she hasn't given it up entirely because it's not practical. But New Zealand does have a leadership role. And it's in agriculture, and it's in the food that you will be enjoying for the rest of the week, knowing that you are feeding your essential amino acids through good meat, good cheese, a certain amount of the milling wheat that John McCall will grow, the delicious vegetables, and I'd love to have a kiwi fruit in the background there as well. But it's what New Zealand does best, and I hope that you are all going to be advocates for the fact that New Zealand produces superb protein, essential amino acids for less impact than the rest of the world can manage, and that we are trying to help them to do even better. Thank you, Tony.
Jacqueline, thank you very much, and I understand you'd be happy to answer questions. Are there any questions, please? There must be a question.
While you're thinking, I will tell you that the strongest thing I do is not read what people say about me on social media. Sometimes my students or my colleagues say, have you seen what they've written now? I said, no, I'm not going to look. You should, it's really, no, I'm really not going to go and look. It would be bad for my mental health.
Would you care to talk about students coming in to universities and learning agriculture? Why are we having trouble bringing so many students in to learn agriculture?
Because they haven't heard you explain what a great place to be it is in terms of what we do. Since I've been teaching since the 80s, and the challenge has been a switch in the way that farming has been regarded, and Greenpeace has that group has a lot to be blamed for in terms of kids. Now, you know that your grandchildren, your children, they are the light of your life. You want them to have a great time in the future. You've told them that they can do anything they want. And there are many, many different areas that they can go into. And unless they see farming and all its agribusiness and scientific components as part of it as a great career, and the science system has been in a complete muddle since about 1992, so it hasn't been the greatest place to be because of uncertainty, then they're not going to go into it. Why do they think the silver screen stuff? Now, I will share that I had to make the decision right from school about whether I was going to go on the stage or stick to what I thought might be useful for the world. And I went through varsity thinking if I don't pass my exams, if I don't get offered a PhD scholarship, you know, all of those sorts of things, and I've done a lot, including some paid. But the point is to make a difference to the world, and I think that you can do that for most people. You can go on making a contribution in terms of science, whereas I probably wouldn't have been Meryl Streep. Certainly wouldn't have been Julia Roberts. So it's those sorts of things. But the colorectal cancer thing for here, and Lincoln's quite struggling with it, is just nonsense. So the nitrate in the water, there is no mechanism that nitrate in drinking water can actually get to your gut because it's metabolized. And most of you will have had a good, healthy, dark green vegetable or beetroot recently. It's got 1,000 parts per million of nitrate in it. Feeling okay? You know, peas are quite good. Yeah, feeling okay? Yeah. The professor of colorectal cancer surgery not a title I would want, by the way, at University of Canterbury, Otago, Canterbury, has said that if we started looking at the Canterbury Plains and people saying there's high colorectal cancer, we could just as well be drawing a correlation with sitting on tractor seats. So, and there's no link to preterm babies. I'm sorry, it's ethnic. And that was the research that came out of the San Joaquin Valley. There was lower socioeconomic. It's the same with New Zealand. Our highest preterm is South Auckland. Sorry. It's not to do with nitrate. And the blue baby syndrome, there's only ever been one recorded death from a child with linked to nitrate. It was in East Anglia, 1974. And if you read the 4-point writing, so I got my glasses and a magnifying glass, it said microorganism contamination could not be ruled out. It was E. coli. And usually the issue is E. coli. And that's why you must sterilise your bottles. You have high nitrate water with formula in unsterilised bottles, you've got a problem.
Thanks. Now, there is a question.
Margaret looks as though she wants to ask a question.
I'm at the back. Hi. Name's Jocelyn Humphreys. Given our ability to produce so well, why doesn't the rest of the world take up our systems?
Because context is all. The minute you look at subsidies, they're not being subsidised to farm efficiently. They switch to farming where they can get the money. The United Nations methane report that was produced last year actually said the best thing we can do, apart from catching these fugitive methanes from the fossil fuel industry, is feed our animals better. Longevity, welfare, longevity, and so they produce more babies or produce more milk, and feed them better. And then you'll get more product per kilo of feed, and that means per kilo of methane. So how can we help? Well, we've done a lot of work in South America, a lot of work in China, but not all countries is it appropriate to try and assist them because they haven't got some of the education, but you know the whole Colombo system, that we've had a lot of people from all over the world until COVID. And so how do we attract more people? It should be from the whole world, but not everybody has what Treasury told us right at the beginning, was the wonderful soils and the water, that most of which comes out of the sky, and the production of our organic matter. So yes, there's been a lot of work and we keep trying. People come to see us and they go back and say, so we must take away subsidies, but they never do. It's called food security. No government will do that to their population. Thank you.
And we have a temperate climate, don't we?
And we have a temperate climate. It's just fabulous. I'm here. That's why I'm here. Margaret does want to say something. She was frowning at me.
Ma'am, you are so persuasive, and you always have been, of course.
I'm so mistaken.
No, persuasive, I
Oh,
said.
persuasive. Oh, good.
What I would like you to comment on is how in heaven's name are we going to prize the scientists out of their silos to start communicating effectively with us to counter what you have been telling us is coming through?
You're not going to get it out of the CROs. That's the trouble. The way that the system is currently run, and it is being reconsidered at the moment, but I'm not sure the outcome is going to be any better. You need... all right, what you are planning seems to other stuff I've seen, maybe it won't be quite what we want. You need the universities, and some of them are too concerned about their funding. Now, some of you may know that I was the inaugural chief scientist for the Environmental Protection Authority, a position that was supposed to be about explaining and talking and educating and just having good fun. When the government changed, the EPA became not independent. And so I chose, it is a matter of public record, that I chose not to go on being employed by the government because I was being told to interpret science in the way that suited, and I won't do that. So then you have to come back to the universities and the adjunct role that I have with Lincoln. And adjunct means, thank you for the title. Pity there's no money involved, but I really appreciate the library access. And they have my publications for their PBRF stuff. So, you know, they're PR, you'll see Lincoln University at the bottom there. So it's the independence, we need to be putting that back in, Margaret. So if we go back to that document, if you can put in the independence and not have boss people changing things as it goes out, because there are very few people that are allowed to speak in the CRIs, I think that's very bad for New Zealand. Universities are, sometimes, you know, there's a bit of debate about it, but the whole point about science is rigour of debate. So that you have scientists within or researchers within the same faculty. I was in the same faculty as Mike Joy. He used to say, where did you get those data? I said, from the science. Oh, I haven't got time with that. I said, Mike, what you're doing is putting off the very students that you want to come into agriculture so that they can do an even better job. He did, oh, I hadn't thought of it like that. 2 hours later, he was back doing it. Farmers are terrible. Well, why would anybody want to go in to an industry that has this redneck environmental polluter when it's just not true? Our waters are beautiful. And you can drink them. Not south of, no, don't drink them out of the Avon or the Heathcote. No, seriously, it's dogs and ducks.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I'll ask Andy Shands.
Thanks, Jacqueline. I've loved your talk. Grateful to be asked to give the vote of thanks, as I'm an ex-Lincoln student of 60 years ago.
I didn't teach you.
In the 60 years, I think dairy must have tripled. Well, wheat production has doubled. Wheat's trebled. I think lambs have doubled. So we've made big advances, and Lincoln and Massey have been right at the forefront, partly the research and partly spreading the word. I've enjoyed your talk this morning. You've emphasised a whole lot of points which us townies really need to know about, how efficient we are in the greenhouse gases leading the world. One of the messages you've given us is the fights that agriculture has as to what's socially acceptable. You've got the misconception of cows are bad, nitrogen's bad, and a whole lot of other myths that is the battle of what to make things socially acceptable. Your talk, I think, has emphasised facts, evidence and data.
Good student, good student.
How important it is, and I have listened. The final thing, I think, the point you made is that somebody is spreading the word, and I think that's you. And I'm very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
I love the talk.
Thank you very much, Andy.
I didn't mention about the milking cows. And
No. Thank you so much.